Article 225.30 of the National Electrical Code, or NEC, addresses the number of supplies to one building or other structure. The code stipulates that the number of supplies is determined by the number of sources from which the premises wiring is supplied. This means, generally speaking, a building or structure can only be supplied by one feeder or one branch circuit. However, there are specific conditions under which more than one supply is permitted, as outlined in exceptions within the article. If you're running two or more circuits to an outbuilding from a main service located in another building, like routing branch circuits from a house to a detached garage or storage unit, a disconnect is required at the outbuilding. This requirement is triggered when you have multiple circuits originating from the same service and feeding the outbuilding. So, adding an extra circuit, even if solely for interior lights, doesn't waive the disconnect requirement. If the outbuilding has no exterior wiring or lighting, the requirement for a disconnect at the outbuilding hinges on the number of circuits serving the outbuilding from the main service. If there are two or more circuits originating from the same service and terminating at the outbuilding, a disconnect is required, irrespective of whether the circuits serve exterior or interior loads. Even if the outbuilding only houses interior wiring, having multiple circuits supplied from the main building necessitates a disconnect at the outbuilding. Although the code doesn't mandate a disconnect for an outbuilding with only interior wiring and multiple branch circuits from the main service, it's generally recommended for safety and convenience. A disconnect switch allows for easy power shutoff in emergencies or during maintenance activities. It's important to note that local amendments to the NEC can exist, potentially imposing stricter requirements. Always verify local regulations with the relevant authority having jurisdiction, or OJ. The National Electrical Code, in Article 225.30, addresses specific circumstances related to the number of supplies permitted to a single building or structure. While the general rule limits a building to one feeder or branch circuit, there are exceptions allowing for multiple supplies under certain conditions. These exceptions consider factors such as emergency systems, legally required standby systems, and other specific scenarios where multiple power sources are necessary for safety or operational reasons. The requirement for a disconnect at an outbuilding is directly related to the number of circuits originating from the same service and terminating at that outbuilding. The presence of two or more such circuits triggers the need for a disconnect, regardless of whether these circuits serve exterior or interior loads. This rule ensures that the power supplied to the outbuilding can be easily and safely isolated in the event of an emergency, maintenance, or other situations where disconnecting the power is necessary. When an outbuilding has no outside wiring or lighting, the determining factor for requiring a disconnect remains the number of circuits originating from the same service and terminating at the outbuilding. If there are two or more such circuits, a disconnect is generally required. However, the absence of exterior wiring doesn't automatically exempt the outbuilding from this requirement. Even if all the circuits serve interior loads, the presence of multiple circuits from the same service typically necessitates a disconnect for safety purposes. While the NEC provides a framework for electrical safety, local amendments or regulations may impose additional requirements or restrictions. These local rules can vary depending on the specific jurisdiction and may be stricter or more detailed than the NEC in certain areas. It's crucial to consult with the local authority having jurisdiction to ensure compliance with all applicable electrical codes and regulations. Installing a disconnect at an outbuilding, even if not strictly required by code, is generally recommended as a best practice for electrical safety. A disconnect provides a convenient and reliable means of isolating the power supply to the outbuilding, which can be essential in emergency situations, during maintenance activities, or when making electrical modifications. Furthermore, a disconnect can help prevent electrical hazards and reduce the risk of electrical shock or fire. Article 225.30 outlines conditions permitting more than one supply. Firstly, special conditions, where the reliable operation of equipment requires multiple power sources. Secondly, emergency systems, as permitted by NEC Section 700.12. Thirdly, legally required standby systems, as permitted by NEC Section 701.11. Fourthly, optional standby systems, as permitted by NEC Section 702.11. Fifthly, fire pumps, as permitted by NEC Section 695.4. Sixthly, parallel power production systems. Seventhly, systems designed for connection to multiple sources of supply for the purpose of enhanced reliability. According to 225.31, disconnecting means must be installed at a readily accessible location either inside or outside of a building or structure nearest the point of entrance of the conductors. If the service disconnecting means is installed at a remote location as permitted by 230.70 AON, additional disconnecting means shall be installed either inside or outside of the building or structure nearest the point of entrance of the conductors. Disconnects for multiple supplies shall be grouped. Each disconnect shall be marked to indicate the load served. 225.32 covers maximum number of disconnects. Firstly, for a building or other structure served by a feeder or branch circuit, the disconnecting means shall consist of no more than 6 switches or 6 circuit breakers mounted in a single enclosure or in a group of separate enclosures at each location. Secondly, a building or other structure served by more than one feeder or branch circuit shall be provided with the disconnecting means for each feeder or branch circuit as specified in 225.31. These disconnecting means shall be grouped and each marked to indicate the load served. One of the main reasons for requiring a disconnect at each outbuilding when more than one circuit is present is safety. In the event of a fault or other electrical issue in the outbuilding, a disconnect allows for the immediate isolation of power to that structure. This can prevent further damage, reduce the risk of electrical shock, and facilitate safe troubleshooting and repairs. Imagine a scenario where a short circuit occurs in an outbuilding served by multiple circuits. Without a disconnect, someone would need to run back to the main service panel in the primary building to shut off the power. This delay could exacerbate the situation and increase the risk of harm. A disconnect located at the outbuilding allows for immediate power shut-off, mitigating these risks. From a convenience perspective, a disconnect at each outbuilding simplifies maintenance and repairs. If any electrical work needs to be done in the outbuilding, the disconnect allows for easy isolation of power, ensuring the safety of the person performing the work. Without a disconnect, it might be necessary to shut off power to a larger area, potentially disrupting other circuits or equipment. Even if the outbuilding only has interior wiring, the presence of a disconnect can be beneficial. For example, if there's a need to replace a light fixture or receptacle, the disconnect allows for safe isolation of the circuit without having to go back to the main service panel. While the NEC provides a comprehensive framework for electrical installations, local codes and regulations can sometimes differ. These local variations may be based on specific environmental conditions, building types, or other factors unique to the jurisdiction. It's crucial to consult with the local authority having jurisdiction, ODJ, to ensure compliance with all applicable codes and regulations. The AHA can provide clarification on any specific requirements or interpretations that may apply in a particular area. They can also offer guidance on best practices for electrical safety and ensure that installations meet or exceed the minimum standards outlined in the NEC. When considering the installation of a disconnect at an outbuilding, it's important to choose the right type of disconnect for the application. Disconnects are available in various sizes and configurations, and the selection should be based on the voltage, current, and other electrical characteristics of the circuits being served. Some common types of disconnects include fuse disconnects, which provide overcurrent protection in addition to isolation, and non-fuse disconnects, which only provide isolation. The disconnect should be rated for the appropriate voltage and amperage, and it should be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions and all applicable codes and regulations. It's also important to consider the environmental conditions when selecting a disconnect. If the disconnect will be exposed to moisture, dust, or other contaminants, it should be rated for those conditions. NEMA ratings, which indicate the level of protection provided by an enclosure, can be helpful in selecting the right disconnect for a particular environment. For example, an NEMA 3R enclosure is suitable for outdoor use and provides protection against rain, sleet, and snow. In addition to choosing the right type of disconnect, it's also important to install it correctly. The disconnect should be securely mounted and properly grounded, and all wiring connections should be made in accordance with the NEC and the manufacturer's instructions. The disconnect should also be labeled to indicate the circuits it serves, and it should be readily accessible for maintenance and repairs. When installing a disconnect at an outbuilding, it's important to consider the location of the disconnect in relation to the other electrical equipment in the outbuilding. The disconnect should be located near the point of entry of the circuits into the outbuilding, and it should be readily accessible for emergency shutoff. It's also important to ensure that the disconnect is not obstructed by any equipment or materials that could prevent access to it. In some cases, it may be necessary to install multiple disconnects at an outbuilding to serve different circuits or equipment. For example, if an outbuilding has both lighting and receptacle circuits, it may be desirable to install separate disconnects for each type of circuit. This allows for selective isolation of power to different parts of the outbuilding, which can be useful for maintenance and repairs. When installing multiple disconnects, it's important to group them together in a readily accessible location and to label each disconnect to indicate the circuits it serves. This makes it easier to identify and operate the correct disconnect in an emergency. The NEC also addresses the requirements for grounding and bonding of electrical equipment at outbuildings. Grounding and bonding are essential for electrical safety, as they provide a low impedance path for fault current to return to the source, which helps to trip over current protective devices and prevent electrical shock. According to the NEC, all metal enclosures and equipment of buildings must be grounded and bonded in accordance with the applicable requirements in Article 250. This includes grounding the metal enclosures of disconnects, panel boards, and other electrical equipment. The grounding electrode system at an outbuilding typically consists of a grounding electrode, such as a ground rod or ground ring, that is connected to the metal enclosures and equipment with a grounding electrode conductor. The grounding electrode conductor should be sized in accordance with the NEC and should be installed in a manner that provides a reliable connection to ground. In addition to grounding, bonding is also required to ensure that all metal parts of the electrical system are electrically connected together. Bonding helps to equalize the voltage potential between different metal parts, which reduces the risk of electrical shock. The NEC specifies the requirements for bonding conductors, which are used to connect metal enclosures, equipment, and other metal parts together. The bonding conductors should be sized in accordance with the NEC and should be installed in a manner that provides a reliable electrical connection. When installing electrical equipment at outbuildings, it's important to pay close attention to the requirements for grounding and bonding. Proper grounding and bonding are essential for electrical safety and can help to prevent electrical shock and fire. Article 225.39 discusses rating of the disconnecting means. Firstly, for a motor, the disconnecting means shall comply with 430.109. Secondly, an air conditioning and refrigeration equipment, the disconnecting means shall comply with 440.12 and 440.14. Thirdly, other loads, for all installations, the disconnecting means shall have an ampere rating not less than the sum of the non-motor loads and the full load currents of the motor loads. Article 225.40 covers access to overcurrent protection. Where the overcurrent protection for a feeder or branch circuit is not readily accessible, branch circuit overcurrent devices shall be installed in the building or structure served. Article 225.50 covers supporting conductors over buildings. Firstly, where supported by buildings, conductors shall be securely fastened. Secondly, where passing over buildings, conductors shall be supported so that they will not readily contact the building. According to 225.52, individual open conductors and cables other than service cables shall not be installed within 3.0 meters of buildings or other structures. Article 225.54 covers the point of attachment to buildings. The point of attachment to a building or other structure shall provide the minimum clearances as specified in 225.19.